All right, it is noon. Welcome everybody for another Iowa Learning Farms webinar this week. So my name is Mitch Harding. I am a water outreach specialist with Iowa Learning Farms. And today we are going to hear from Abigail Schulte, a graduate student at Iowa State University, and she's going to talk a little bit about solid state anaerobic digestion of prairie biomass and beef manure. So again, if you have any questions throughout today's presentation, please feel free to put those in the chat at any time, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to pass things on over to Abigail.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. So yes, as he mentioned, my name is Abigail. I'm actually a former graduate student. I just graduated this last May with my master's in agricultural and biological systems engineering from Iowa State. And so my thesis topic and what I've been working on for the last 2 years is solid state anaerobic digestion. If you've heard of anaerobic digestion, there's a decent chance you haven't heard of solid state. So it is an interesting technology I'll go over a little bit today. So basic agenda. I'm going to introduce the Sea Change project that I'm a part of. It's an Iowa State project, and then talk about anaerobic digestion, and then segue, of course, into what solid state anaerobic digestion is. And then I'll go over 3 of the different experiments I did of optimizing this, and I'll talk about why that's important whenever we look at the economics. So starting off with the Sea Change project. The Sea Change project is an interdisciplinary institutional grant funded by USDA NIFA that is working on establishing value chains for cover crops, specifically herbaceous feedstocks. So we're looking at switchgrass, miscanthus, corn stover, and then, of course, prairie biomass that I'll be talking about today. It's a phenomenal project I've had a great opportunity to be a part of for the last 2 years. It's a collaboration between Iowa State, Penn State, and then our private partners at Raceline Alternative Energy. It's been a phenomenal project that has really helped guide my research. So, prairie biomass is the 30 million acres of Iowa used to be covered in prairie. However, within 70 years of European arrival, less than 1% of that remains. So we're seeing all host of agricultural issues as a result of the agricultural land. However, the work conducted by Dr. Schulte Moore and the STRIPS project at Iowa State found that strategically converting 10% of existing agricultural land back to prairies can result in a 37% decrease in water runoff, a 20 times increase in soil retention, and much lower nitrogen concentration in the water supplies. These are all great ecological services. However, they don't provide any value for our farmers in terms of monetary. So there exists a need for economic incentives through what can we do with this biomass. And because it's prairie biomass, we can't eat it. That's why we got rid of it in the first place. So we have to establish some sort of other value chain for prairie biomass, enter anaerobic digestion. The other biomass that is used in this project is beef manure. So 1.3% of the United States greenhouse gas emissions are associated with manure management. And then 3% of the methane emissions are associated specifically with beef manure, with dairy manure, very similar, occupying the other large chunk. We have 166 million kilograms of manure produced by beef cattle yearly. We have plenty of manure. It's available to us. We have it in plethora, might as well use it to try and generate some sort of renewable energy. And then specifically in just this last month, we've seen the U.S. carbon sinks and emissions report come out, and we can see that improving manure management practices resulted in a decrease of 1.8 million metric tons CO2 equivalent from 2021 to 2022. And so these are various manure management practices: composting, when to land apply, how often to land apply, acidification, aeration, and then, of course, anaerobic digestion. So anaerobic digestion, we can see on the left is a graph of the amount of anaerobic digestion systems on the farm in the United States. So you're seeing a definite gradual increase. And then on the right is a list of all the operational biogas systems versus the potential biogas systems. So if you look specifically, we can anaerobically digest pretty much any sort of biogas, any sort of biomass that we have available. Food waste, landfill, wastewater treatment are 3 areas where landfill and wastewater especially are blossoming fields and have been a little bit more established. Livestock waste, there's definitely a gap to be filled there, and Iowa only has 7 anaerobic digestion projects currently established. So there's definitely room for different anaerobic digestion. Is there a potential for it? So let's go ahead and talk about what anaerobic digestion is. So anaerobic digestion is a 4-stage microbial process that takes place in an environment without oxygen. That's what anaerobic means. So during this, the microbes that are only active in anaerobic conditions eat away at the biomass and produce methane. There are 3 inputs: water, biomass, and heat. We'll start off with heat. There are 3 different temperatures that you can use. psychrophilic, mesophilic, and thermophilic. So psychrophilic are going to be your covered legumes. You're not really adding any heat to the system, just whatever heat, geothermal, solar, whatever you can get, that's the temperature it's going to operate at. With our more established reactors that are more traditional, you're going to run at either mesophilic or thermophilic temperatures. Mesophilic is body temperature. It's about 35 degrees C, 97 degrees Fahrenheit. And then thermophilic is about 55 degrees C, or about 140, 150 degrees Fahrenheit. So there are pros and cons with each of them. There are different anaerobic microbe communities that activate with different temperatures. It really is another optimization route. So then the second input is biomass. As I mentioned previously, this can be almost anything biological. A lot of times with agricultural waste, we see manure, but then we're also seeing a push for what's referred to as co-digestion, which is where you take a manure and then another sort of agricultural waste like corn stover in order to add some sort of stability to the reactor and also add energy value to it. And then finally, you have water. A traditional anaerobic digester operates at anywhere from 1 to 10% total solids. So 90% of the mass or volume inside of an anaerobic digester is water. Now, water is necessary for microbial activity, but it is not, it is necessary for microbial activity, but it is not, you can't produce methane from water. You need the biomass. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. And so it goes through the 4-stage process, and at the end, you're left with 3 products again. So the first one, and the one that is the most important and has the most value added to it, is biogas. So about 20 to 40% of the biogas that you get out is carbon dioxide. This is largely a waste product and will be removed. The other 50 to 70% is methane. This is the value, CH4. This is what we're going to use with 2 things to see how we can establish value with it. Now, there are a few other gases that might be produced, ammonia gas, hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen gas. But for the most part, our main dominant gases are carbon dioxide and methane. There are 2 things we can do with this methane. One is a combined heat and power system. So we can take this methane and we can use that heat generated in order to run the anaerobic digester. In an ideal world, in a system where the anaerobic digestion is working perfectly, the system is inherently exothermic. So it produces more energy than it takes to run. So the combined heat and power system allows us to utilize the heat being generated to run the anaerobic digester. And then the extra power, the extra heat, can be turned into electricity to offset the grid around it. So that's the sort of smaller scale system. It doesn't quite have quite as much money associated with it as natural gas upgrading, which is the second one. This is where we get into a lot more of the financials of it. You get into your LCFS, your renewable fuel standard credits, your D3 RINs, all the complicated policy economic decisions that I am not super qualified to talk about. But using that RNG injection is really where we start to see these economies of scale and definite financial abilities come into play. So that is anaerobic digestion. And then the second product that you get out of it is digestate. So digestate, when it comes out of a conventional anaerobic digester, it is going to be pretty liquidy, right? We've removed carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in the form of our carbon dioxide and methane gas. So the manure that already had the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, it's still there, and it's in perhaps a more concentrated and sometimes less volatile form. So a lot of times we see the ammonia that is present in manure convert to ammonium. And ammonium is a lot less toxic to fish, so we're avoiding the eutrophication issues. The digestate, there are 2 things you can do with it. A lot of times you'll see just land applications similar to how we do manure injection. That is something that it can do. And then another option is liquid solid separation. So this is, again, a slightly more costly aspect where you separate the digestate, the solid digestate, from the water. So then the water gets recycled back into the system, so we're decreasing water consumption. And then the digestate can again be land applied or used for bedding. Now, an important thing I want to reiterate is that 90% of the volume inside of an anaerobic digester is liquid. It is volume, and you cannot generate methane from water. And this is a really high water margin, especially when we're looking at these larger systems. So solid state anaerobic digestion attempts to address this issue. Solid state is classified as anything over 15% total solids. So we have at least minimized 33% of the water consumption of a traditional anaerobic digester. On the right, we have 4 different models on how solid state systems work. With solid state, the issue you run into a lot is that you're sacrificing homogeneity for less water. If you look inside of an anaerobic digester, it is typically a very homogeneous slurry, right? There might be occasional bumps and lumps, but for the most part, it is a solid slurry. With solid state, if you look inside of a solid state anaerobic digester, it is a solid. And so mixings become a lot harder. And so with mixing, you're essentially sacrificing this homogeneity. So the Dranko, Compogas, and Valorga systems are all mimicking of a conventionally stirred tank reactor. They're just using different methods of stirring instead of just a traditional stirrer. So the Dranko system uses gravity. The Compogas system uses essentially an auger. The Valorga system has a paddle that spreads the entire length of the reactor. And then the Beacon system is the style that is used the most and is the garage style system. So with this one, we're not actually moving the biomass. The biomass is staying in what is essentially a shipping container. And instead, the mixing mechanism is percolation. So you're sprinkling water or percolate liquid through the system, and that does the mixing mechanisms for you. The Beacon system or garage-style digester composes of all solid-state projects in the United States, of which there are 7. So solid-state is not a huge system. It's not super well done. It's not super well explored in the United States. It is pretty well explored in Europe. There are quite a few solid-state systems in Europe, but not quite as much in the United States, and they are all treating industrial or municipal waste for the most part. Now, the benefits of solid-state anaerobic digestion are, one, in terms of methane quantity and quality. In terms of how much feedstock you were feeding into the reactor, it is typically comparable, right? So if I put in 1 kilogram of Prairie into my conventional anaerobic digestion and my solid-state system, I'm going to see similar rates of methane. So there's no trade-off in terms of methane quantity. And when we look at a volumetric basis, as I mentioned earlier, because there is less water, you can put more biomass into the reactor at one time. So you have a higher organic loading rate and you'll have higher productivity on a volumetric basis. You have less water usage, clearly, and so that can result in lower operating costs. And then because you have less water, it typically requires less heating. So if we go back to the initial endothermic versus exothermic, if you have less heat required to run the system, so you decrease your parasitic energy consumption, you're going to see an increase in the amount of energy that you can off-put elsewhere. So that's the benefit there. And then with easier handling of digestate, I talked earlier about how liquid-solid separation is a little bit difficult with your conventional anaerobic digester because you have a liquid coming out. With the solid systems, most systems I've talked to don't have to do liquid-solid separation. They just have to let it out to dry for a little bit, and then they're good to do whatever they need to do with their digestate. Now, the cons of the system, it is a batch system. So you load it in, you seal it, you let it sit for 35 to 50 days, and then you load it out, typically using a skid loader. This batch system results in downtime. So you'll have downtime just loading and unloading. You'll have downtime as you have a lag phase with microbial growth. So a lot of times with solid state systems, you won't have just one digester. You have 3 or 4 operating in parallel. So that way you have offset lag phases. So that's something to consider. And then the big reason for why we don't see solid state anaerobic digestion systems is the high capital cost. Solid state systems are exponentially more expensive than a traditional anaerobic digester. However, the reason for this is because it's much harder to establish anaerobic conditions. If you are not anaerobic, you will not have a functioning digester. With a traditional liquid anaerobic digester, as long as you are underwater, you are inherently anaerobic, right? As long as you're not on that surface, you're not exposed to oxygen. With solid state, because there is no underwater per se, you have to take additional efforts in the actual reactor itself to make it anaerobic. That is what I've been told is the large reason for why solid state costs so much more. I still don't fully understand it. So if anybody has any insight, please feel free to let me know. But with solid state, that is sort of the issue, is it's a CapEx versus OpEx question. Because if you look at the pros, less heating, less liquid solid separation, higher biomass yields, all of those result in a lower operating expense. The capital costs, obviously, we can't really do very much about. So there haven't been a whole lot of literature about this. This is a decently established field, but it's not super wide. And there has been one techno-economic analysis conducted of manure technology, and they found that a solid state system, when compared to a liquid anaerobic digester, did have a higher net present value when you take into consideration the decrease in operating expenses. So my work for the last 2 years has been looking at other ways that we can decrease operating expenses, decreasing water consumption, decreasing heating, and power consumption in other ways. So we'll go ahead. I've got about 10 minutes left, so we'll go through all of my various experimental results. So my experimental setup, keep in mind, these are typically done in shipping containers. Those are big. I do not have them. So I designed a 600 milliliter flask bottle, essentially, that is able to simulate the solid state system to the best of my ability. So you'll see it has a peristaltic pump that does the percolation method for me. All of these were operated inside of a mesophilic incubator with a 35-day reaction time. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then the way you make it anaerobic in lab settings is you just purge it with nitrogen gas. In commercial settings, you typically just seal it and let it become anaerobic on itself. With percolation liquid, it is a strain degasified secondary digestate. A lot of our solid state systems rely upon a liquid system in order to establish a healthy bacterium before we start the solid system. It just helps elevate the process and it provides a little bit more stability than relying on whatever microbial communities are naturally in the manure. And then the Prairie biomass is from the ISU Cobb's experiment, and then the beef manure is from a small farm in Northwest Iowa. And then down below is just some quantitative information about our biomass. So specifically with the prairie biomass, if you'll notice, the prairie biomass and the beef manure have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 24 and 25, or 94 and 25. Typically with anaerobic digestion, and you want a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 20 to 30 to 1. So this beef manure is already pretty well suited for anaerobic digestion in and of itself. So that's something I explored as we sort of went to the higher end of an optimum carbon to nitrogen ratio. Also of note is the cellulosic content of the prairie mass. In order for prairie biomass to qualify for D3 RINs, which is again a huge source of revenue for these potential projects, it has to be 75% cellulose. Testing has shown that the prairie biomass specifically used in this experiment is 78% cellulosic, so just barely sneaks in, but it does technically qualify for D3 RINs if a pathway was established for that. So this is the first experiment I did. So this is specifically looking at the mixture ratio of prairie biomass to beef manure and the total solids content. So I looked at 3 total solids content. So we're trying to decrease the amount of water as much as possible, 15%, 25%, and 35%. And then 7 different ratios going all the way from pure prairie to pure manure. So we're looking, typically literature suggests that the best ratio is a 3-to-1 biomass, or lignocellulosic biomass is the technical term, to 1 part manure on a volatile solid basis. However, I wanted to explore the slight higher end of the scale just to see if, maybe we were almost to the mountain, but we weren't quite to the peak. And then I used a 1-inch particle size and continual percolation. Those 2 variables will be changing in later experiments I'll go over. And if you look at my results, you'll see that the highest producing spot was at a 3-to-1 ratio at 25% total solids. However, there wasn't a significant difference really in that 15 to 35% range in that 2-to-1. So that middle 3 rows, all of those produce very similar amounts of methane. So depending on feedstock availability, if you had a really wet manure to begin with, that 15% 2-to-1 might not be the worst situation. But if you existed in some miracle hypothetical world where you had a lot of prairie biomass, that 4-to-1 ratio would produce very similar amounts to a 3-to-1 ratio. So it's sort of flexible within it. And then solid state anaerobic digestion, like anaerobic digestion, has incredibly high variability because you have such interesting microbial communities that'll form differently. And one thing of also note is that the pure manure, so specifically that 140 number, you'll see that while it does produce more biogas than just prairie on its own, adding prairie biomass to the manure did increase the methane potential for that area because it adds stability and it adds extra energy value to our feedstocks. So that's the first experiment that I did. So the second experiment, we're going to continue operating at that 3-to-1 prairie biomass to beef manure ratio at 25% total solids. So now that we've determined that optimum, we're going to move on to a second optimization. And so this one looks at particle size of the prairie biomass. When the prairie biomass is cut and taken out of the field, it is then milled. And so that last experiment was at a 1-inch particle size. And so the question was, how small do you mill the prairie biomass in order to extract the most value out of it without, expending more energy than it gets us? So with prairie biomass, conventionally, you're going to see a 1/4 inch as being the best size, and it's typically industry standard. So my experiment showed that going from a 1-inch to a 1/4 inch increased methane yield by 10%. And if you look at the bottom row of that table, the net energy produced is far greater than the net energy of the inch. size milling. So that works great because the theory is is that as you mill the biomass smaller, it becomes more available for microbial growth. So if the smaller it is, the better. And with liquid anaerobic digestion, the smaller is better. But with solid state, you run into an interesting issue. So going from the 1/4 inch to the 2 millimeter, you'll see that it actually decreased methane production by 3%. And that is because with solid state anaerobic digestion, you have to have inherent structural integrity, right? We have a percolation system. And one of the issues I ran into back with that old pure manure system is that the manure essentially melted. It didn't have the structural rigidity to stay in the chamber. It needed the prairie biomass in order to stay in the chamber and latch onto. The 2 millimeter suffered from a similar issue, and that it again lacked structural integrity. And what ended up happening in at least one of the experiments is it compacted to the point that the percolation liquid was unable to trickle through, and so it pooled on top. So unlike liquid anaerobic digestion, in which, there aren't any structural issues that occur with the smaller particle size, it's just more a question of, is the energy expended worth the energy you get out? Solid state does have a little bit more fine tuning to do because there is too small of a particle size with the garage style system, because otherwise you run the risk of it going through the percolation system. So that's the particle size system. So then the next experiment uses the 1/4 inch particle size and the 3:1 ratio. So this experiment looks at the question, how often do you have to run the pump? Traditionally, in solid-state anaerobic digestion systems, you're running the pump 24/7. That pump never turns off. But there is some literature out there to suggest that maybe you don't have to run the pump. And maybe it's actually better if you let the microbes sit and eat away at the biomass before you move them again. So if you look at the experiment down on the bottom left, you'll see the continual system did outpace the 4-hour and 8-hour cycles. So the 4, 8, and 12-hour cycles mean that they were on for 30 minutes and then off for 3.5, 7.5, and 11.5 hours. However, going from the continual to the 4-hour only resulted in a 3% decrease in methane yield. So we went from 268 to 260, and it saved 87.5% of your pump energy. So that seems like a pretty good energy balance of, yeah, you're losing a little bit of methane, but at the end of the day, you're saving a lot more energy in running that pump. So you're going to have greater energy expenditures. And then the second point is the no percolation. You'll see that gray line down at the very bottom highlights the importance of percolation when it comes to solid state anaerobic digestion. A lot of times in both the lab scale, there's a lot of inclination to just, let it sit. And the percolation method is indeed really critical to let those microbes spread out as much as possible. And the final thing of note with this graph is if you'll notice there is an increased lag phase as you decrease the percolation frequency. So the continual cycle gets going pretty quickly. Instead, the 4-hour, 8-hour, and 12-hour, they take progressively more time to get out of that microbial lag phase. So what I'm proposing, unfortunately, I ran out of time to test this, is to run the pump continuously for the first 5 to 10 days, and then eventually slow down to a decreased percolation cycle. So that way you reap the benefits of both worlds. You're going to have increased methane yield and decreased power consumption. Now, if you've seen traditional anaerobic digestion graphs, you know that traditionally you're going to see an S curve. So it's going to start off with a lag phase. You're going to have a period of exponential growth. And then as this biomass slowly runs out and becomes more difficult to reach into the components that the microbes can eat at to get the biogas, it's going to flatten. None of my experiments thus far have flattened. After day 35, they're all very linear. So I haven't reached that peaking point yet. So with this experiment, thankfully, I was able to run it for 80 days. So you'll see about day 45 or 50, we do see a drastic slowdown. Now, the 4-hour and 8-hour cycles are still producing methane. They haven't stopped entirely. But realistically, with an anaerobic digestion system, you'd probably cut it at day 45 or 50, start it over, and get back into that exponential growth phase. So that's the 45, 50 days is the overall sort of method. So then summary, I'm almost done. So the maximum methane produced was 268 milliliters of methane per gram of volatile solid, 35 days, a 3:1 prairie biomass to beef manure ratio at 25% total solids, quarter-inch prairie particle size, and continual percolation. The 4-hour cycle, however, resulted in only 3% decrease in production, with 87.5% savings for pump power. The optimum reaction time seems to be about 50 days, and then it produced 320 milliliters of methane per gram of volatile solid after all. So all told, all of these are different ways of trying to increase the profitability of solid-state anaerobic digestion of beef manure and prairie biomass by decreasing the operating costs. So,
All right. So as we continue to get questions in, I'm going to go through these last few slides here. So if you're watching the webinar today for CCA CEU credit, please send the following information: your name, the name you entered the webinar with, and your CCA number to Elena Whitaker. Her email is alenaw@iastate.edu. Please do that by the end of the day today, by 5 p.m. today. If you go on to the next slide. Please take our voluntary demographic survey if you haven't already for 2024. You only need to take this survey once, so if you've already done it, no need to take it again. But if you haven't taken it, please go ahead and do that. And then please join us next Wednesday at noon as we are, as Tom Eisenhart, professor of natural resource ecology and management here at Iowa State University, talks a little bit about riparian management in agroecosystems. All right, so we've gotten a couple questions in. Starting off, how is prairie biomass collected? Kind of start there.
yeah, so I will confess to not being the best person to answer this question. But so because one of the issues with prairie biomass, so prairie biomass is going to be located and harvested in a similar way to any of your sort of grasses, wheats. I'm not an agricultural kid, I'll confess I don't know how to harvest wheat. However you harvest any form of, stalks, I think I've seen scythe things, so yeah. I'm not the person to answer this question.
No, that's totally fine.
They harvest it and they send it to me.
So, and maybe, I don't know if you know this question, the answer to this question either, but do you know how diverse the prairie mixes are, kind of what species may be in that?
So I do not know the exact species. I know one of my colleagues is actually doing work to see the anaerobic potential of individual species so that we can develop a consortium that is indeed best suited for biomass. And then obviously with prairie biomass, you have to make sure it is native to the land. You have to make sure it is the natural, inherent, what is going to be there. We don't want to introduce predatory invasive species to these prairie strips. And then there also is a lot of, I had a third point. And then also with prairies, you have to burn them every few years in order to increase your biodiversity, because there are some species of prairie fauna and flora that are only activated after that burning. So you do still have to maintain the normal burning cycles for at least a few years of establishing the prairie.
All right. So somebody mentioned, or you mentioned earlier about how solid state anaerobic digestion is considerably higher costs. Do you kind of know what the cost of a solid state anaerobic digester is, or where does that fall, I guess?
Yeah, so it's typically a difference. The financials are a little bit more obscure. And the nice thing about the solid state systems is they've typically been municipal systems. So they have to let me know how much things make for taxpayer reasons. Typically, we're seeing a difference of about 5 million between a conventional anaerobic digestion of the same size and a solid state system of the same size. And then I have been informed on the harvesting the prairie biomass systems, silage harvester or round baling, and then pre-processing the material. I have been informed on. Shout out to my colleagues in the chat who have told me how we harvest it. So yeah.
Awesome. So somebody asked about the harvest schedule that needs to be established, or kind of how often the digester needs to be fed.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that my team is currently working on, is trying to figure out the impact silage has upon the system. It is something that you would maybe harvest 50% every other year. So you'd have to have 4 times the amount of prairie that you needed annually in order to run your biomass. So it's an interesting game that the team is currently playing, of trying to figure out how do you harvest the most biomass as possible while ensuring health of the prairie, and you're still reaping all those ecological services.
Somebody asked, how large are these systems? Are they, I guess what's the scale of each of these systems or one of these
So
systems?
with solid state systems, you're typically looking at a shipping container. There are some that are slightly larger than a shipping container, but you're typically looking at a shipping container sized vessel as your actual reactor. And as I mentioned, you'll typically see them in parallel. So you'll see 3 to 4 of them running simultaneously in order to offset those lag phases that you see with solid state systems. So they're not super large because, as I mentioned, you can fit more biomass into the system than a traditional anaerobic digester.
Awesome. And then your colleague added in there also that in native prairies, they're usually harvesting about or between 20 to 30 different species of grasses and forbs. So pretty diverse mixes, it seems
Yeah.
like. Um, Another question we had in, could you explain a little bit more about how a solid state anaerobic digester meets those anaerobic conditions? Is there a mechanical thing pulling that air out, or is it since it's not based or relying on the
So
water?
yeah. So the solid state system, I'll just go back to that nice handy diagram. So it's really critical. So some systems do indeed have some sort of vacuuming mechanism in order to get as much of the oxygen out. But other systems, if you've ever been told to, stir up your compost pile, it's because you're trying to prevent anaerobic conditions from occurring. So if you just leave your pile unstirred, it will inherently start to become anaerobic. And so it's a matter of competition with these solid state systems of eventually the system consumes all of the oxygen inside the system and all the oxygen has been used. So now you are anaerobic. So there's two sort of styles on if you make it anaerobic or if you just let time naturally make it anaerobic for itself.
All right. So that seems to be all the questions that we have for today. So I want to thank you again, Abigail, for talking. Again, tune in next week. We'll have a webinar once again with Tom Eisenhart. He'll be discussing some edge of field things, some biomass stuff, or not biomass stuff, but with agroforestry. So thank you again, Abigail. With that being said, I'll give you the last word if there's anything you'd like to say.
No, thank you so much. This has been a really great opportunity. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm available. I think you can find me somehow.
All right. Very good. Well, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next week.